The room was quiet, but not calm. It was the kind of quiet that comes right before something irreversible happens. A private hotel suite high above New York City, sealed off from the outside world, filled with smoke and tension so thick it felt physical. 12 men sat around a long table, and every single one of them was armed. Guns rested in jackets, holsters pressed against ribs, hands hovered close to death without touching it. This was the Mafia Commission, the most powerful criminals in America, men who had ordered executions without raising their voices, men who had survived wars, betrayals, and prison sentences that broke others. And tonight, they were all in one room, close enough that a single gunshot would turn discussion into slaughter. No one joked. No one relaxed. Eyes watched hands. Bodies leaned back just enough to allow movement if it came. Every man understood the same unspoken rule. If someone reached for a weapon, everyone would have to follow. Survival depended on reaction time. And in the middle of that room sat Lucky Luciano. He didn't sit like a king. He didn't command attention. He looked almost casual, as if this were just another meeting, just another night. His posture was loose, his expression unreadable. To an outsider, he might have looked unaware of the danger, but Lucky was never unaware. He was reading the room the way he always did, slowly, patiently, absorbing every detail. Chairs shifted slightly as the discussion moved forward. A foot tapped, a glass was lifted and set back down untouched. Small movements that meant nothing on their own, but together signaled that something was wrong. This meeting had been called for a reason, and it wasn't going to end quietly. Every man there knew what was at stake. The commission existed to stop chaos, to prevent personal fear from dragging everyone else into disaster. It was a fragile balance, held together by agreement rather than force, and balances like that didn't break loudly. They snapped. Lucky felt it before it happened. The subtle tightening in the room, the way one man's breathing grew heavier, the way another stopped pretending to listen and started calculating. This wasn't just tension. This was a countdown. Everyone in the room was armed, but no one wanted to be the first to move. The first move would be the last mistake. Outside the hotel, New York was alive. Traffic lights changed. People laughed in bars. Taxis rolled past without slowing down. The city had no idea that inside this quiet suite, the future of organized crime was hanging by a thread. Inside, the silence pressed down harder with every second. Lucky didn't adjust his chair. He didn't reach inside his jacket. He didn't scan for exits. He sat perfectly still, as if movement itself were unnecessary, as if he already understood something the others didn't. This wasn't about who was fastest. It wasn't about who was most violent. It was about who controlled the moment. The room felt smaller now, walls closer, air heavier. Every man there sensed the same truth. One sudden motion would not start a fight. It would start a massacre. And in a room where everyone was armed, where one move meant death, Lucky Luciano didn't move at all. Because he knew the most dangerous thing in that room wasn't a gun. It was what was about to be decided. The danger in that room didn't come from the guns. It came from pressure, the kind that builds slowly, invisibly, until even disciplined men start making desperate calculations. Outside the walls of that hotel suite, the world was changing, and the underworld felt it first. For years, power had been predictable. Money bought silence. Fear bought loyalty. Problems were handled quietly and quickly. But now, something had shifted. Prosecutors weren't playing the old game anymore. They weren't taking calls. They weren't accepting favors. They weren't chasing headlines. They were building cases slow, airtight, patient cases that didn't collapse when one witness disappeared. That terrified everyone. Prison sentences weren't symbolic anymore. They were long, long enough to erase reputations, long enough to dismantle empires piece by piece, long enough to turn men who once ruled neighborhoods into forgotten names behind bars. The old system, built on intimidation and influence, was cracking under a kind of pressure it had never faced before. Most of the men in that room had adapted. They diversified, spread risk, learned to operate quietly. They accepted that survival now required restraint. But one man couldn't accept it. His world was built on visibility, on dominance, on the idea that fear solved problems before they grew. And now, fear wasn't working. That's what made him dangerous. When men like that feel cornered, they don't slow down. They accelerate. Every warning sounds like betrayal. Every suggestion of patience feels like surrender. The idea of waiting, of trusting a system instead of instinct, felt like a slow death. Lucky Luciano understood that psychology better than anyone. He had seen it destroy entire generations of bosses, men who mistook violence for strength, men who couldn't tell the difference between control and impulse. The commission was his answer to that weakness, a structure designed to absorb pressure instead of exploding under it. But structures only work if people believe in them. The pressure that night wasn't just legal, it was emotional. It was identity-level fear. The realization that the old rules no longer guaranteed safety, that power no longer meant deciding who lived and who died on a whim. For men raised on that belief, the loss of it felt like annihilation. That's why the room felt volatile. Not because anyone wanted chaos, but because chaos felt familiar, comfortable. In moments of fear, people reach for what they know. And what some of those men knew best was violence. Lucky watched it happening in real time. The subtle signs, shorter tempers, tighter jaws. The way arguments stopped being about solutions and started being about control. Pressure doesn't create monsters. It reveals them. The commission was supposed to protect everyone from this exact moment, to slow decisions down, to force logic into rooms where emotion usually won. But that meant telling certain men no. And men who had never been told no didn't handle it well. That was the real danger. Not the prosecutors, not the indictments, but the moment when fear turned inward, when desperation stopped being private and became public. That's when rooms like this explode. And as the pressure kept building, one truth became impossible to ignore. The next decision wouldn't just determine who survived the investigation. It would determine whether the old world died quietly or went down shooting. The proposal didn't arrive softly. It landed in the middle of the room like a dropped weight, heavy enough to bend the silence around it. Eliminate the problem, end the pressure, kill the threat before it destroyed everything. To the man who said it, this wasn't recklessness, it was instinct. The same instinct that had kept him alive for decades in a world where hesitation meant weakness. The room reacted immediately, though no one raised their voice. Cigars paused mid-air. A glass stopped halfway to a mouth. Eyes shifted, not to the speaker's face, but to the hands of the men around the table. Everyone understood what had just been suggested, and everyone understood the cost. This wasn't a street hit. This wasn't business as usual. This was the kind of act that would light a fire no one could put out. Lucky Luciano didn't interrupt. He never rushed moments like this. He listened, watching how the words settled into the room, watching who leaned forward, who leaned back, who stopped pretending. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, almost disappointing in its lack of drama. He didn't argue about courage or loyalty. He talked about consequences, about attention, about how some actions don't end problems, they multiply them. He asked one question. What happens after? No one answered. That silence mattered. It meant the logic had landed. One by one, others began to speak. Not passionately, not emotionally. They backed Lucky's position with the same quiet certainty. Killing the threat wouldn't protect them. It would expose them. The commission wasn't built to save individual men from desperate decisions. It was built to ensure the survival of the whole. That was when the divide became unmistakable. On one side were men who believed the future required restraint. On the other was a man who believed restraint was surrender. To him, every word of caution sounded like abandonment. While his freedom felt like it was slipping away, everyone else wanted patience. Discussion, time was the enemy. Lucky raised his hand slightly, bringing the room back into order. This wasn't personal. That was the point of the system. No threats, no shouting, just procedure. He called for a vote. For a moment, the room went completely still. This was the commission asserting itself. Authority not backed by fear, but by agreement. One by one, hands went up. Slowly, deliberately, each one a decision. Not just about this proposal, but about what kind of organization they were going to be. The result was decisive. The proposal failed by an overwhelming margin. The rules stood. For a brief second, it looked like the system had worked exactly as designed. The danger had been discussed, measured, and contained. Then a chair scraped back hard enough to cut through the quiet. The man who had lost the vote stood up fast, disbelief hardening into rage. This wasn't just disagreement. It was humiliation. He cursed the rules, mocked the idea of votes, spoke about blood and fear, about how this life was really built. His voice sharpened with every word, cutting through the room like broken glass. To him, this vote wasn't a decision. It was a betrayal. Lucky stayed seated. That was the moment fear changed hands. He didn't argue. He didn't rise. He simply reminded him of the vote. The numbers, the process, 11-1. This was how things worked now. The decision was final. That sentence did something dangerous. It took away fear, because it made something clear that could no longer be ignored. The rules weren't suggestions. They were authority. And authority no longer belonged to the loudest man in the room. Hands drifted closer to jackets. Eyes locked across the table. Every man there understood the risk. When someone rejects the system openly, there are only two outcomes. Either the rules collapse, or someone decides they don't apply. And as the tension tightened, one truth became unavoidable. The vote hadn't ended the danger. It had just stripped away the last illusion holding it back. The moment the hand moved toward the jacket, the room stopped breathing. Every man there recognized that motion instantly. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't argument. It was the point of no return. A slow, deliberate reach, the kind that meant a decision had already been made. The gun came out smoothly. .45, automatic, heavy, unmistakable. The metal caught the light as it cleared the jacket, and for a split second, the only sound in the room was the faint click as the grip tightened. The weapon was raised, not rushed, not shaking, and aimed directly at Lucky Luciano's head. 3 feet. That was all the space between life and death. No cover, no warning, no chance to react. At that distance, skill didn't matter. Speed didn't matter. One squeeze of the trigger would end everything in an instant. No one moved. Not because they were frozen, but because they understood the consequences. 12 armed men in a locked room. One gunshot wouldn't be the end. It would be the beginning of chaos. The kind that turns seconds into funerals. Anyone who reached for a weapon would force everyone else to do the same. Lucky Luciano didn't move either. He didn't push his chair back. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't reach inside his jacket. He sat exactly where he was, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, looking straight at the man holding the gun. There was no panic in his face. No surprise. Just focus. The silence stretched painfully long. Cigars burned down unnoticed. Sweat gathered at temples. Every man in the room felt the weight of the moment pressing into his chest. This wasn't just a threat. This was a challenge to the very idea of order. If the trigger was pulled, the commission died with the sound of the shot. The gunman's finger rested on the trigger. His breathing was controlled, but heavy. This wasn't a bluff. It was an attempt to take power back, the only way he knew how. Still, Lucky didn't blink. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, calm, almost casual. Not the voice of a man begging for his life. Not the voice of a man threatening revenge. The voice of someone explaining a fact. "You pull that trigger," Lucky said. "And you better kill every man in this room." The words hit harder than a punch. For the first time since the gun came out, hesitation crept in. Just a flicker. But it was enough. Lucky continued, his tone unchanged. laying out what would happen next. Killing him wouldn't restore control. It wouldn't end the pressure. It wouldn't solve anything. It would create 11 enemies, 11 organizations, all united by one purpose: revenge. "You're not killing a boss," Lucky said. "You're killing the system." That sentence changed the math, because it made the future unavoidable. Even if Lucky died, the commission would survive. It would harden. And the man who pulled the trigger would spend the rest of his life being hunted by people with more money, more soldiers, and more patience than he could ever escape. The realization settled slowly. The gun hand began to tremble, not from fear, but from understanding. The power he thought he held was already gone. It had shifted the moment Lucky spoke. Seconds passed. Long ones. Then, slowly, the gun lowered. Not slammed away, not thrown aside, just lowered, heavy and useless, before disappearing back into the jacket. The rage drained from the gunman's face, replaced by something hollow. Lucky Luciano hadn't moved an inch. 3 feet from a bullet, he proved something no act of violence ever could. In a room where everyone was armed, the most powerful man was the one who didn't need to move at all. When the gun went away, the room didn't relax. It settled, like dust after an explosion. No one spoke. No one needed to. Every man there understood that something irreversible had just happened. Not because violence had occurred, but because it hadn't. The man who had raised the gun stood still for a moment, scanning the room. What he saw wasn't fear. It wasn't loyalty either. It was distance. Invisible, but absolute. The kind of distance that tells you the room has already made a decision about you. When he finally turned toward the door, no one followed. No one stopped him. That silence was deliberate. He wasn't being expelled. He was being left alone. Lucky Luciano remained seated. That was the detail no one would forget. He didn't stand to assert dominance. He didn't speak again to reinforce his authority. He didn't even watch the man leave. He stayed exactly where he was, as if the moment had unfolded exactly the way he expected it to. Calm wasn't an act for Lucky. It was a position. That's when they understood why he hadn't moved. Lucky didn't stay still because he wasn't afraid of the gun. He stayed still because he wasn't fighting the man holding it. He was fighting something larger. He was defending the system. And systems don't flinch. In that room, everyone was armed. Everyone had the ability to kill. But Lucky understood something most men never do. The fastest way to lose power is to prove you need violence to protect it. The moment he reached for a weapon, he would have reduced himself to the same level as everyone else. Just another man reacting to fear. Instead, he forced the fear to move around him. By not reacting, he made the gun meaningless. By not raising his voice, he stripped the moment of chaos. By not standing up, he made it clear that authority didn't come from posture or threat. It came from inevitability. Killing Lucky wouldn't have restored order. It would have destroyed it. And everyone in that room understood that the moment he said it out loud. That was the real reason he was untouchable. Not because no one could kill him, but because killing him would solve nothing. The commission meeting ended without ceremony. Men stood, adjusted their coats, and filed out quietly. But the silence carried weight. From that night forward, the rules weren't theoretical. They had been tested under the worst possible conditions and had survived. The consequences came later, quietly, efficiently. The man who had challenged the system didn't last long in a world that no longer tolerated instability. There was no announcement, no explanation, none was needed. Authority doesn't justify itself, it enforces itself. From that night on, organized crime changed. Meetings replaced shootouts, votes replaced vendettas. Violence didn't disappear, but it became controlled, purposeful, rare. The mafia became quieter, more disciplined, and far more dangerous because of it. Lucky Luciano's greatest power wasn't that night. It was what followed. Even when he later went to prison, the system held. Decisions were made. Rules were followed. The commission continued exactly as designed. That was the ultimate proof. That is why Lucky didn't move. Because he wasn't defending his life. He was defending the future. In a room where everyone was armed, Lucky Luciano stayed still because he didn't need a gun to win. The system had already decided the outcome, and once a system becomes stronger than the men inside it, those men become replaceable. That night, the Mafia didn't choose fear. It chose order. And Lucky Luciano became untouchable not by surviving violence, but by making it irrelevant.